name is Anna Grace Wade, and I am a future educator. And I'm going to be sharing about my experience in a school this past semester, to share some about what I've learned as a future educator, and hopefully you will find this helpful. So during my field experience, I focused on two main topics. My two topics that I chose were classroom management and instruction, which go hand in hand, and the theories that apply to those. And then the next one was theories on assessment. And so my observations over this past semester were done at a classical Christian school in Peachtree City, Georgia. And so my goal is to give you, the future educator, several tips for success that I've seen to be effective with the theories that I've learned about in my college online courses. And so I have spent some time thinking through the theories and applying them and seeing them lived out in the classroom. So let's dive right in. Okay, so we are going to start with instruction and the theories that go with that. And so the first part of my observations at this school, I was with a teacher named Miss Smith, and she taught mostly high school students and also had one 8th grade class. So I got to observe Miss Smith's instructional strategy throughout her many different classes and grade levels. And so there are many different strategies that teachers may take to give instruction and to manage their classroom well. These strategies are authoritarian, permissive, detached, and authoritative. And I'm just going to focus on authoritative because it seemed that Miss Smith's strategy for classroom management was the authoritative strategy. And I also believe this to be the most effective in the classroom. So the authoritative teacher has a balance of being demanding with high expectations in her students while also carrying a warm and respectful attitude. Students need high expectations to push them and to motivate them in their education. And having a teacher who expects much out of them and has a lot of discipline and order in the classroom and is also warm and helpful will lead to a hardworking and cheerful student who's passionate about learning and their education. And so that leads to my number one tip for success that I learned from Miss Smith. It's to be a warm and demanding teacher. It creates a classroom with students who flourish and know what is expected of them. And so this is my goal now also as a future educator, seeing Miss Smith live this out and the other teachers that I got to observe. And so the second part of my observation were done with another teacher. This was the kindergarten teacher, Miss Wood. And while in her classroom, I was considering how her communication played a really big role in the success of her classroom management. Miss Wood would use verbal communication and nonverbal communication. Her verbal communication looked like giving clear and detailed instructions to her students. An example of this would be when she was transitioning topics, she gave very clear instructions like she would tell the students, your pencil box needs to be on top of your desk. And I'm going to pass out these papers. You need to make sure your pencil is on top of your pencil box. Don't touch it. You're not writing on your papers. It's not time for that yet. So let me pass these out. Your hands should be to yourself. She would just be very clear about what was expected of them. And there was just a lot of order and not a lot of wiggle room. And so her nonverbal communication would look like maybe a tap on the shoulder if a student was not focused or was being too talkative in a time where the students were supposed to be doing individual work and quiet. Another way that she would give nonverbal communication that really showed me that this is how the respect was built in her classroom between her students was when they would talk, she would give a lot of nods to assure them that she was listening and understanding what they were saying. And she also verbally asked follow-up questions, which just showed them that she was listening and cared about what they were saying. And so she was another example of the authoritative teaching style of she had a lot of order in her classroom and discipline for her students, but also was warm and welcoming and loved to hear what they had to say. And so this comes to my second tip that I learned from Miss Smith in the classroom, and it is do not leave wiggle room. And so this is especially for the younger students and the younger grades. It could also be true for middle schoolers and high schoolers, but I definitely see this more in the younger grades. And so time in the classroom that is not accounted for can easily turn into an unmanageable classroom. And Miss Wood was so prepared that she didn't leave wiggle room in between activities. She cut down on distractions by having an organized timeline. Even in her lessons, I saw her often checking the clock to make sure she was on time with what she had planned for the day. And she was always one step ahead of what could be a potential distraction, like the pencils, making sure that the pencils were placed on the pencil box so that it wasn't a distraction for them when they had their papers handed to them. And so that is the second tip that I have. Do not leave wiggle room in between activities. So the second topic that I looked into are the different theories of assessment. And for this portion of my observation, I began to observe a different teacher, Ms. Johnson, who was a second grade teacher. And so as I sat in her classroom, I was really considering the different forms of assessment. And the different forms of assessment are formative, informal, formal, and summative assessments. And so Ms. Johnson, one thing that she did to really help with formal and summative assessments was she used review over and over again. And so Ms. Johnson used consistent review almost every single day in her classroom. Every time that I was there, she did some form of review to begin class. So this would look like their morning work when they walked into class, and as others were entering the classroom, they would sit at their desk to start off the morning and work on previous lessons and problems from previous days. And so doing this, it really helped her students master concepts, and they also began to see their school as interconnected and fluid. And so the review helped them apply their learned concepts to new concepts later that day when they would learn something that was maybe more difficult. The use of review, it ensures that valuable concepts are not lost and forgotten over time. Review also builds a student's confidence when it comes to taking exams because they feel well equipped and familiar with the material. And so a good example about review, if you think about math, it's really important that you remember past concepts about math to be able to apply the concepts that you already know to new concepts, to be able to interpret it and make sense of it. Just because math is so cumulative. And so she did a really good job at this, Ms. Johnson, of doing this in her classroom, of bringing back old concepts to help them understand new and more complex ones. And so this is the third tip that I have for success for future educators and that I will definitely be using. And this is use extensive review. Another theory that I looked into and was thinking about in her classroom was the theory of assessment. And the theory of assessment has 5 main steps for the educator, and this is to have clear instructional goals and communicate them to your students. The second is to select appropriate assessment techniques. The third is to use assessment to enhance motivation and confidence. And then adjust instruction based on information. And lastly, to communicate with parents and guardians. And so this theory was extremely practical, and I saw Ms. Johnson live it out in her classroom. And while I can't talk about every single step of the theory and how she lived it out, I do want to give one example and one step that she really lived out. One way I especially saw this theory have success is in step number 2, which is adjust instruction based on information. Ms. Johnson adjusted her different tests to fit for the different subjects to fit the students' diverse needs and the varying subjects. For example, math was basically all not done just with a pen and paper. But phonics, she would read it out loud and do it orally, and they would write down what they needed to with pen and paper. Ms. Johnson knew her students' needs and knew what forms of assessment would give her accurate feedback on her students' knowledge. This means that as a teacher, you have to be willing to review and edit and work on changing your test maybe for future students, always reevaluating the way that you're teaching things and the way that you're testing your students. And so this comes to my last tip for classroom success that I feel like is very practical, and it's just know your students. As a teacher, you must know your students because each student has a different way of understanding things and learning things. And so to help students, we have to first know how to help them learn, and then we need to learn how to accurately evaluate what they know so that we know where they need help and guidance, and just to get an accurate depiction of the things that your students know. So these 4 tips that I have given are strategies and concepts that I hope to really live out as a future educator and to do in the classroom. And I saw all 3 of the teachers that I observed portraying these ideals. And so the thing I love about these tips for success is they are true for almost all grades and all students, for many different kinds of students from different backgrounds. All students need a kind, hopeful teacher who believes in them. All students need a teacher who is organized and prepared with things to share. All students need to review the material they have learned to prepare them for future exams, and all students deserve to be known and understood. As I think back to my years in elementary school, middle, and high school, I think of all of my favorite teachers, and everyone can normally think of a teacher that has motivated them and influenced them in the past. And as I think about them, they all fit into these 4 categories. Hopefully, these 4 tips gave you an idea of some of the things that I am passionate about and believe in as a future educator in the way that I'm going to teach and manage my classroom. And I hope you found some of this information helpful as you continue your education and prepare to lead students in their education. Thank you so much for listening.